This episode's made possible by Planful.
Hi, this is Efren Rivera, the CFO of Paychex, and you are listening to the CFO Thought Leader Podcast.
This is episode 931.
If our general ledger provider or our FP&A tool provider came to us and said, we've got a pretty cool AI tool, you should look at it, we probably might roll our eyes a little bit until recently and think of that as something that our customers would be interested in. Why would we in finance have that much of a need for it? We're now taking that mentality with a task force that we structured with representatives on each and every function and turning it on its head. So we have people in customer support, professional services, HR, contracts, legal and accounting, as well as accounting, all of those functions across the business who are part of this task force. And we are in turn charging them to come with guidelines set up, in particular on security and compliance, data privacy, data protection, just overall security and compliance has become so much more of a topic for businesses.
Hi, it's Jack. On today's show, we speak to Jeff Laborde, CFO of JAGGAER. The year was 2015, but for Jeff Laborde, a seasoned finance leader kicking off his second C-suite tour of duty, it was as if he had just been transported back to 2005. Or was it 1995? As Laborde entered a meeting room, an executive, noticing his presence, stopped the meeting in progress and queried across the room, "Jeff, what are you doing here? Why are you in my meeting?" Having only recently joined the company as CFO, Laborde tells us he was seeking to sit in on different company meetings in order to better understand how the company operated. However, not all management was on board, and Laborde soon realized the siloed finance function is still alive and well in business today. You'll hear that story and much more on today's episode. We'll begin after this.
Hi, I'm Rowan Tonkin, Chief Marketing Officer at Planful, and we're a proud sponsor of CFO Thought Leader. At Planful, we're empowering teams just like yours to drive peak financial performance in every corner of your business. What sets Planful apart? We have purpose-built applications for every department, from FP&A to accounting, marketing to HR, all with built-in financial intelligence. This means we can get you up and running within weeks, and it requires minimal IT involvement. So you can rapidly and seamlessly engage everyone across the business in your key financial processes. Best of all, you can't outgrow us. We take the pain of growing away with an unmatched ability to scale with you. You have an endless runway with Planful. See why over 1,300 customers around the world choose Planful as their flexible, user-friendly, end-to-end financial performance management platform. Go to planful.com and see how you can make financial performance a team sport in your business.
Hello, we're speaking with Jeff Laborde, CFO of JAGGAER. Jeff, welcome.
Great to be here, Jack. Thanks for having me today.
As always, Jeff, we ask our guests to look back. And what we're interested in finding out from you are some of the experiences you feel prepared you to be a CFO. What would come to mind for you?
I think taking a step back, it's a very intriguing journey that I wouldn't change anything about. Intriguing is probably the wrong word. I might modify that by saying unique. Very often, frankly, fellow CFOs I've come in touch with in my network and otherwise have come up a more traditional way, public accounting into corporate finance, and then worked their way up corporate finance. I started in public accounting out of undergrad, went to a small university in Virginia, and there was a heavy recruiting class out of the Washington, D.C., at the time, Big Six, which is now Big Four. I landed at Arthur Andersen in their audit and business advisory group, and kind of lucked out. I got put into their startup practice, which in the DC area meant mostly small software companies before software really was what it is today, and a bunch of biotech. And I got in turn fortunate because of that focus on small companies to get pulled into a couple of IPOs, a couple of financing rounds, and even a couple of M&A transactions. And I started to have my first exposure to investment bankers, actually, including one S1 drafting session where I showed up to do our auditor part, and had these guys roll in with nice suits. They drove nice cars. You could tell in the parking lot. They started telling everybody what to do. And they sounded pretty smart. They were talking about things at a higher level, a little more strategic, where I was just trying to make sure the numbers all tied. And I remember thinking to myself, I want to learn more about what those guys do. And that actually led me to business school. And I used that to change my career into investment banking, which led me for 12 years, went from the East Coast after business school out to San Francisco in the year 2000, kind of right as the internet bubble was reaching its peak. And spent 12 years doing technology investment banking, primarily in mergers and acquisitions for a couple of banks. Goldman Sachs was the second of the two. And then lastly, the kind of final step over to the CFO role was about 12 years ago. And it was as simple as and unique as having a banking client who I knew very well, a private equity firm that focused on software companies, firm by the name of Vista Equity, offered me my first role as CFO of a portfolio of one of their software companies that just so happened to be based back in the Southeast. So I got to come home as part of the move as well.
Your timing does seem kind of interesting. I mean, you Arthur Andersen sounds like a really unique opportunity. They had these interesting sort of offshoots of their business, and it sounds like that was one of the more interesting ones. But going back to business school, coming out with your MBA and landing in the Bay Area in the year 2000, just as that .com experience begins to happen. Looks like you had it all together, but then the economy wasn't about to cooperate.
It's very perceptive of you to double click on that, Jack, because it was, in retrospect, very influencing, I think, of my ensuing 20 plus years of work. I came out of business school, newly married, bought our first house in the Bay Area, which was not inexpensive, just as it isn't today. It wasn't then either, even with the internet bubble looming. My wife and I had our first child. And here I joined a group with Credit Suisse. You may recall they had just merged with DLJ, which was another large investment bank. And the tech group that I stepped into went up about 40% in size. And over the next 3 years, from 2000 to 2003, the bank basically undid that because of the pressures of the economic recession that we were having at the time, and investment banking activity and revenues declining. The group that I was in downsized from over 250 to less than 100 bankers over that time frame. And for me, it was as much of a fear of survival with these new responsibilities that I had not had prior to that point, that I made sure of two things. I was never going to have anyone question my work ethic. And so for the period of those 3 years, I think I left my cell phone on all times, 24/7. Anybody needed me, I wanted to be the person there, including when my wife had our second child. I think I still had my phone on. And then secondly, that I wasn't going to be one of those folks who got caught up in the disruption of the layoffs or the restructurings and redundancies, because there were a lot of people who had such a tough time, and they'd start to tune out or ask a lot of questions or get distracted. And it was almost as if there was a self-fulfilling aspect of that I really wanted to make sure I avoided. So that head down, work hard, effectively always be on call, weather things through thick and thin, stay focused were two really big lessons I learned in that experience.
And that's good, because then you joined Goldman Sachs, and less than 2 years later, we're in the financial crisis. I imagine you're in an area that might not have been as impacted, but still, it's just sort of a theme for the investment banking world for that first decade of the 2000s. Yeah.
It sure is. It's definitely helped me manage, I think, elements of in moving over to the corporate finance role from investment banking. Two bright contrasts, one of which is as an investment banking team, smaller teams working on engagements, and you could affect an outcome, a multi-billion-dollar transaction, something you read about in the newspaper. And if there was a problem, you could literally gather as a team and collaborate and try to negotiate with the counterparties to find a solution and impact that outcome literally through your own efforts, your direct quantifiable efforts as to whether that was a success or failure, whether it got done or not. It wasn't always in your control, but you could certainly tie results to effort in very short periods of time, chapters or engagements, if you will. Jump over to the corporate world, and I think it's not the same. You're not as much of a speedboat. You're a bit more of an aircraft carrier. You're part of a much bigger team. Things don't turn on a dime, and your roadmap and your objectives are much longer term, and they take longer to impact. And I think that was kind of a dramatic lesson. And then the other one was, I think it also helped me deal with what I didn't appreciate was a facet of corporate day-to-day existence. But it seems like almost every day as a CFO, there's an oh crap moment where something comes out of left field at you and either threatens to poke a hole in your forecast or your nice laid budget plans. Some litigation, some customer dispute, some employee issue. Take your pick. It's something new every day. But I think being able to ride those ups and downs, being at a place like Goldman, when the world thought during the Great Recession in the 2007, 8, 9 timeframe that the world was going to collapse, the financial system was going to implode on itself, I think really did help steel me for those moments where, although you're with a much smaller company and you're one of the officers, and while that's certainly got its own set of anxieties and nerves and stress moments to balance, I think that really helped me put it in perspective. Cruise through it. Don't get, again, overly distracted by the anxiety or the negative energy. Try to stay calm, focus on the issue, and then what you can do within your and the team's control to manage through that as best as you can.
So 6 years with Goldman, 12 years all totaled in the investment banking world, I think.
That's right.
Where along the way did you begin to think about jumping to the operations side? When was that something that just towards the end of your tenure there, that 12-year tenure, or did it happen sooner?
I think it actually happened towards the latter part after the Great Recession, where I really started to do some soul searching as to having lived through the internet bubble, which tore the banking business apart, and we had to put the pieces together again. And then the Great Recession, the financial crisis. I figured those were once in a lifetime events. And here I was within the span of 10 years, I had 2 of those quote unquote black swan type events that almost that really struck to the foundation of investment banking and those business models. And I remember actually sitting down with one of the big 4 headhunter firms. She was trying to recruit me, and this was about 2010. So things had stabilized, but I still felt pretty burnt or distracted from the Great Recession. And I remember saying to this headhunter, look, what would be your recommendation on the best way to get out of investment banking? Especially with the fact that I have a CPA, which is not all that common for investment bankers. And she said something to the effect of, well, if I had $1 for every time I heard that from a banker who wants to get out of investment banking, I would have retired by now. And she gave me some invaluable advice at that point in time, which I think was intuitive, but she put a fine point on it, which was to make this kind of a transition, which is not trivial. You need to find somebody who knows you, who trusts you, and you're comfortable with too, to then identify the opportunity to ask you to come over. And clients can oftentimes be the best source for that kind of a transition. Even with that being said, a lot of those transitions with investment bankers and their clients often involve going into non-CFO roles. Very common, it would be investor relations, treasury, as well as heading up corporate development and M&A functions. But that CFO role was a little less common, although certainly not unprecedented. And so with that mindset, I think I embarked upon a 2-year process that wasn't structured, but was now just a bit more informed about keeping my eyes and ears opened a little more in my client engagements to see where there might be that kind of a fit. And it played out exactly as she suggested, or it kind of intonated that it might play out in the end.
When you do step into the CFO role for the first time, I think the company's ultimately sold, which has happened to a number of the companies you've been part of. I have to imagine your investment banking skill set has come into play in this sense frequently. But tell us a little bit about the type of CFO you think if you have a CFO brand, what would that brand be today?
It's a great question, Jack. I probably, to answer that most effectively, I should have surveyed team members that I've worked with across, and I'd say, interestingly, not just finance team members. One of the things that investment banking allowed me to bring, especially my time in M&A, where you're really being asked to help justify an acquisition or a sale or a merger. And it's not just about the numbers, although that's a critical piece of it. There's strategic rationale, the logic behind the deal, and your ability to be kind of creative and intuitive, as well as a bit farther reaching in some of the potential advantages that could arise from that transaction. I think that's probably what distinguishes, I would think, me most with that background in a corporate setting, where I remember one of my very early Arthur Andersen training sessions. They were talking about the importance of moving as accountants from riding in the back of the car, which is bad enough when your client's driving in the front of the car. But not only were we riding in the back of the car, but more often than not, our procedures and our testing and our the audit services were really structured for us as if we were sitting in the back of the car, looking out the rearview window, so facing backwards. And I think the learning to face forwards and look and kind of tie the various information sources, tie your historical accounting together with your forecasting, and really not just take other teams or functions inputs, but understand the non-core financial inputs, move outside of the four corners, the box of finance, if you will. And I think that banking experience, what I've heard it described that I think resonates with me or describes me, is that intellectual curiosity. Like, don't ever lose that intellectual curiosity that causes you to be complacent. Always, there are things you do well, and there are things that you don't do well when it comes to forecasting and planning and budgeting. And never get complacent. Test the things you're doing well. Why? How can you do them better? And then certainly double click on the things that didn't go so well or that you missed. And you don't do that by sending your teams out to figure it out or just playing with the numbers in the Excel file. In my experience, you do that by going out into the business, by being a part of commercial discussions or engagements, surveying and understanding a bit more of what's going on in customer support, professional services and implementation activities, new product development and engineering, all things which may not be common and familiar territory for a CFO, but certainly things that when I was covering software as an investment banker, I know impacted the deals and the transactions that I was working on. It's the story behind the numbers, the story behind the story, and really getting into the business and being a bit more of an operational / strategic CFO. In short, that's how I would think of describing my brand, if you will, Jack.
You of course, stepped into the CFO office at JAGGAER in 2020, but between Goldman Sachs and JAGGAER, there were a number of different CFO tours of duty. And I'm wondering, all tech, largely tech, or what do they have in common, the companies that you've occupied the office with?
Yes, all tech, all software technology, which was a pretty common thread, and I learned something new at every one of those stops. That the other common thread is private equity. 5 of the 6 companies where I've worked have been private equity owned. including with some clients, some former clients, starting with that very first role. The only outlier of that group was one short tenure at a public company, which was also a relationship that I had well prior to that, dating back to my banking days. But I think the track you oftentimes hear of CFOs is going from public companies, working their way up to be a CFO at a public company that is then taken private, and they move into the private equity world. I kind of started in private equity, tried the public, but then realized I really liked too many aspects of the private equity model that I jumped back over. And in that case, my next company was reuniting with one of the CEOs from my very first business, which was great. But the 5 of those 6 have all been private equity software-backed companies, Jeff.
And again, there you have networked. It's your relationships. Recruiters are involved from time to time, or not really?
From time to time, I'd say as a secondary consideration, they can be helpful. It's rare that something out of the blue, someone who doesn't really know you and you really don't have much connection with them or their firm. I found that to be maybe early as the first step or second step. I think of that as just, frankly, a little higher risk of goodness of fit. For someone who knows you, knows where you've come, knows what you've done, particularly if there are other private equity firms that you've worked with before and can circle back to because of the nature of their portfolios and how those turn over. And for firms of size, it seems they always have interesting opportunities coming up. But I think that people who know you and have some form of connectivity and rapport are usually much better at helping align, if they're a third-party placement firm, that opportunity with the candidate versus a cold call. Although I have had one cold call and it worked, and I can't say it's got a failure rate of 100%. By no means is that the case, but certainly that the personal network comes very natural to me because that was actually a core requirement of my investment banking days. You were selling yourself and the bank, and no one ever knew when an M&A or an IPO transaction was going to come up. So it was up to you to maintain those relationships for when something did arise. And that skill has been helpful to me as the various private equity opportunities that I've had where we've had a liquidity event monetized, and it gave rise to an opportunity for me to move on. That has proven to be quite a powerful asset, that network.
Now, before we jump to the business segment, I want you to think back when maybe your network was just beginning to form, and whether there was an individual who pointed something out to you, gave you a piece of advice, like hold on to that guy's card. But there was some sort of networking insight that someone might have given you. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe something else is occurring to you.
Yeah. Oh, yes. There are probably 2 in short that jump out at me. One is literally my very first job, aside from mowing lawns, was with a very small research house. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and offshore oil is one of the few businesses there outside of tourism and other basic professional services industries that keep the city going. And I knew I wanted to do something vaguely in finance, and through I think my mother's networking, if you can believe it, I actually got my very first role. Didn't even really know what networking was at that point, but I had the benefit of hitting it off with the gentleman who headed research at this small boutique at the time, and he took me under his wing. And it didn't end at the end of the 3rd month when my internship was over. And I went back to that contact, and he went on actually to be a CFO, and coincidentally enough, years and years later. And we managed to stay loosely in touch over the years. But the context that he provided other people on my behalf, especially as someone who was young and trying to find his way in the world, was irreplaceable, because I knew that through our bonding and staying in touch, and me giving him regular updates, even when he didn't ask them, and these were the days before email, and I actually had to write notes or give him a phone call, allowed him to serve me throughout my career in a way where at times I've kind of hassled him to see if I could help his kids. It's the kind of thing where I could never pay him back, but directly, but could I pay him back indirectly? And I think that was an important lesson on the value of connections. It's not just about the here and the now. It can be for the rest of your career, and that the right way to look at it is for the long term. It may help you in a current opportunity, but it may not. Don't force it, but use it as an opportunity to stay in touch. And then the second one was a very senior and tenured investment banker at Goldman who wasn't even in the software sector that I was covering, but took me under his wing early on. And I think he had moved laterally. He had come from Lehman Brothers over to Goldman. And he said, Jeff, coming into Goldman's not that easy because it's a very different culture. Many of the most successful at Goldman, but not all, have been homegrown and have been promoted internally. And so there are a few things you have to understand. And he in that discussion, I remember him talking about his approach to networking with clients. And one of the things that I still use today and still think about today is it's not just getting to know somebody and finding some connectivity socially, business-wise, commercially, or otherwise. For him, it was listening in a way and asking questions to probe where you can find out what that person is, what their problems are today. Whether it's a commercial problem, a business problem, or a personal problem, doesn't matter. But you're having a conversation that you are using to figure out and keep track of pain points or issues that they're struggling with, to then be there to help connect solutions to those problems, whether as a banker or as just a professional colleague, whether now or in the future. And I think you put the two of those together and they've served me well.
Yeah, excellent. Really, really nice. Both of them are terrific. The first one, I just can't, I think you're so right. I think we meet people all the time during the course of our lives, and some of them, this one stepped up early for you, and actually just stepping up like he did. There's an incentive to stay in touch with somebody. He might not be the perfect fit for where you're headed or your career, but someone who's willing to step up like that is rare. We'll jump to our business segment now. Again, we might have a few more career-related questions during the mentoring round for you, Jeff. Right now, let's find out about JAGGAER. What does this company do, and what are its offerings today?
Yes, JAGGAER's a business based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, that has been around for over 20 years, currently private equity owned by the firm Cinven, that has a large presence here in the U.S., originally based out of the U.K., that focuses on assisting companies throughout the world, public sector and private sector, large and small, in managing their business spend and procurement processes to ensure that the company's management team, not just the procurement department, but all the way up to the CFO and the rest of the executive team, have a really good handle at its most basic on how they're spending their money. And you can envision certain companies that have maybe a less complex structure or need in terms of analyzing their spend. For example, take a software company. 80+% of our spend is labor, versus a manufacturing company where you have a multi-layered supply chain, and you have to keep track and tabs on all of the facets of each of those pieces, each of those parts along the supply chain. What are they supplying you with? What's their pricing? What's their timing? And then more recently, and it's one of the real fun aspects of being in a business like this, take into account more of the dynamics that almost anybody today is dealing with in terms of sourcing goods and services. And by that, I mean, COVID changed everything in terms of the world's and business leaders' views on how they should be sourcing goods and services. And it wasn't just redundancy. It wasn't just understanding who's going to be disrupted in what part of the world due to the lockdowns or shutdowns that were rolling around because of COVID. It was coming out of COVID and understanding all of the various pain points and pressures in the supply chain, taking what had been offshore and nearshoring it. And our tools help with all of those facets. But then, as we all know, Jack, the economy didn't just get right back into its groove. We ended up having to deal with ESG becoming incredibly important. We started to see very material foreign currency fluctuations impacting businesses and their planning, particularly those that had aspects of their businesses that were international. We were in an inflationary interest rate environment to deal with inflation, not just the inflation on the cost of goods, but the working capital and companies managing their cash flows. And then throw into that, a war between the Ukraine and Russia. All of those things were just one after another creating dynamics that for anybody running a business in today's day and age and trying to manage their sourcing of goods and services, many of those had been seen in the past, generational type changes and dynamics. Rarely had anybody ever seen all of these come together at once. And so our products in terms of, we go all the way from sourcing of goods and services to payment of those and everything associated within that. We provide advanced analytics, and we have a number of different applications that sit on top of that that rely upon big data, machine learning, and actually AI in a way that we felt lucky to be on top of early, that it does now feel like the rest of the economy or rest of the market is showing an increased interest on, in particular around some of the regenerative AI advances that we've seen of late. But just to wrap up, whether the market's going great and businesses is expanding, or the market's in a recessionary environment, in both situations, it's one of the things I really like as a CFO about a business is we're somewhat acyclical. Customers really have a need for us in both instances and kind of everywhere in between.
Now, again, you stepped in, I think, in 2020. Can you give us maybe an abbreviated history of the company's capital structure? It's a private company, or could you just give us a short history of it?
Sure. The company was, as I mentioned earlier, the company had started over 20 years ago. And I'd say the core of the business was a company called SideQuest, which was founded in the North Carolina area, and that's why that's basically our connection to that area and where we currently still have our headquarters. And SideQuest went public as a business that focused on facilitating in their initial primary core vertical market, higher education. So anything beyond kind of primary education and with a domestic focus. They grew and expanded. They went public, were taken private, went public again, and then were taken private. And in this most recent take private, Cinven stepped in to acquire the business from the most recent private equity owner who had taken them private. In the ensuing years up to Cinven's ownership, SideQuest had grown quite a bit, but still domestically, had added other verticals, including healthcare, public sector, and life sciences, some financial services, and some retail, and a host of other customer verticals. They had acquired 2 additional businesses really to break into the international global markets, one that focused on direct procurement. Today, prior to that time, SideQuest was primarily indirect procurement focused, which are more of the goods and services that you can get off the shelf, versus direct is anything that needs piece parts put into it. That is when we say direct versus indirect. So one of the acquisitions was sizable, based over in Austria, that got us into the direct market, and then an additional acquisition based in Italy that complemented our indirect capabilities and allowed us to move into additional verticals. And that brought the business to where we are today at over 1,200 employees, with, again, Cinven as the company that took ownership late 2019, just before COVID hit us. And what we've been chugging along, continuing to really integrate and develop, take advantage of the resources and the people that we got through those acquisitions to really deploy at this whole basket, as I mentioned earlier, of challenges that executives in today's business world are dealing with in running their businesses. and having a solution that can service those when it comes to their broader spend needs.
It sounds like you're opening a new chapter of sorts, and we're curious. We refer to it as lines of sight. How you look into the business today. Companies that grow through acquisition sometimes have multiple systems and what have you. And as the finance leader, how are your lines of sight? What's happened so that you've organized finance to allow you to see the data more quickly, more easily? What would you tell us?
It's interesting. I mean, I think of where we've come, not in my 12 years as CFO, but just the last 3. Things as simple as, yeah, we used to care about foreign currency, but it was very predictable. The volatility was minor, at best. I think the last time I had to worry about foreign currency was in 2013 or 2014 when the Japanese yen was in the tank, and we had a chunk of our business at the time that unexpectedly declined. Today, we just about every single metric that we report out to our board, to our executive team, is done both on a constant currency basis and an actual currency basis. And one of the things that we used to do passively that we're now doing actively is to try to better match our revenue in a given geography to our cost exposure. So put differently, if our revenue comes down because of a net adverse change in FX rates for us, ideally we want to hedge that revenue decline naturally by having costs in that same region. And if the revenue is coming down, those costs are going to come down for the exact same reason. So we don't suffer as much of a direct hit of just having revenue in that country that would move down. That's one. Another one, which just jumping ahead more to the last 12 months, was understanding who we had all of our cash with. Cash, in most cases for domestic businesses, you really didn't give it much of a thought. You kind of went to someone who could provide you the basic services without a lot of fees and extra costs, and ideally give you some interest on your cash deposits. You never really worried that much about them going out of business, especially post the Great Recession and TARP and all of the bailouts. Felt like we were with the stress tests in a pretty good place until SVB. And all of a sudden, we were looking around first and foremost in kind of probably the hierarchy of needs, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of way. Where's our cash? Is it safe? Is it with a quib domestically? And then for an international business, understanding if there was any ripple-on effect and making sure that all of our international banks were of a size and scale that we felt covered. And then kind of breathing a sigh of relief and saying we don't think we have exposure to SVB or potential domino type smaller banks. Quickly realizing, oh my gosh, what about all of our customers? What if some of our customers have their cash tied up or are disproportionately exposed to SVB? And we actually found some that were, particularly some tech businesses, recently public businesses that were having cash restricted for a period of time. And then lastly, we kind of in that sequencing very quickly went to, well, what about all of our vendors? Is there going to be any disruption associated with people from whom we are receiving critical services that we require to help us run our business? So that again is another area that we haven't seen. I would say lastly, as a third topic, has really been more just using some of the really good tooling that's out there in addition to our own to understand areas, our investments, not at a macro level, but I would call micro ROI, micro return on investment, where we really are. It's arguably just a repackaging of what people used to call project finance, but a software company most people don't think of as having project finance, but we still do have initiatives, investments, new markets we're entering, et cetera. And whether it's requests for additional headcount, third-party resources, any additional spend, or even existing spend, testing that, especially with the inflationary pressures we're seeing on a lot of our third-party providers' services and even just wages, and making sure that those investments, which made sense last year, 5 years ago, in a lower recessionary rate or lower recessionary environment and a lower interest rate environment, whether those investments still make sense and have an adequate ROI with a different view on our hurdle rates than we had in the past. And that's a lot more automated today than it was when I first started doing this 12 years ago. So I'd say those are three of the big areas as a CFO that we've really looked at. They aren't the only ones, but those are the three that jump to mind.
Do you have, is there an FP&A team? Is it two individuals, or can you tell us a little bit about your talent and how you deploy it? Yep.
Sure. Admittedly, I've largely stayed in the range of businesses that have it between 2 and 500 million of revenue. And I think that is a good fit for me. I certainly banked as an investment banker a lot of early stage startup companies, but I also like having a team. I also like it being international. I like it when we're big enough that the problems are complicated. And it's not to say small companies don't have complicated problems, but I think the scale, the scope, and those dynamics certainly keep me focused and interested. And so, yes, we are big enough that we absolutely have an FP&A team. And we divide our global finance team really across three relatively traditional categories, the first of which is financial planning and analysis, which in our case includes treasury and cash management. Secondly, we have accounting, our global controller. We do have a lot of foreign subsidiaries, and that team is our largest of the three. And then the third is taxes. I'll say taxes go on that list of didn't have to pay much attention, as much attention to it prior to 2016, but things have changed a lot going back to that Taxpayer Relief Act in 2016, and a lot of the impacts that were actually even targeted at private equity-backed debt financed businesses like us. And so we've definitely had to reallocate some resources to the tax on the tax front to try to manage a lot of these former deductions getting reduced or outright going away that we've seen in the last few years. We do have elements of each of those groups, except for tax, represented in each of our major geographies as well. We have some FP&A and accounting team members in Europe, as well as here at our corporate HQ in the U.S.
You mentioned generative AI earlier, and we've been asking finance leaders whether AI is impacting how their finance teams operate, and whether maybe members of your FP&A team have returned to you and experimented with the tool in interesting ways. I don't know, or maybe there are just different discussions being had about how we can leverage some of what's out there. Any thoughts on AI for us today and how it'll impact your business and how you operate?
Yes, it's a very timely question, and it's one that's getting a lot of airtime at JAGGAER. What we did is really draw a line where we didn't feel the need for one until recently. We have been, as I alluded to earlier, we have been working very hard to incorporate early elements of AI into our products. We believe procurement is very well situated for some of the benefits that AI brings, including adding in automation, but also adding in the intelligence aspect of it through what in many cases historically have been seen as relatively manual and mundane processes in procurement, whether it's account payable, invoice reconciliation, or even running sourcing events to go out to your supply chain or your network of vendors and try to secure the best price and the best performance from your group of suppliers. And the line we drew was basically saying that product-facing, customer-facing set of efforts that we have should continue, and we're going to pour some more resources into that. However, we now really need to start to look at, exactly as you alluded to, Jack, the whole other side of the house, the internal-facing side of the business. So how do we add efficiencies, even if we don't yet know which service or which tool or which provider we want to use? How do we increase awareness and internal education from each function across the business outside of those who historically are familiar with it because they're working with our customers and our products on it, but are now like in finance. If our general ledger provider or our FP&A tool provider came to us and said, we've got a pretty cool AI tool, you should look at it, we probably might roll our eyes a little bit until recently, and think of that as something that our customers would be interested in. Why would we in finance have that much of a need for it? We're now taking that mentality with a task force that we structured with representatives on each and every function and turning it on its head. So we have people in customer support, professional services, HR, contracts, legal and accounting, as well as accounting, all of those functions across the business who are part of this task force. And we are in turn charging them to come with guidelines set up, in particular on security and compliance, which it's easy, as you know, in many of these kind of new frontiers for people to sprint ahead and think of the use cases. However, data privacy, data protection, just overall security and compliance has become so much more of a topic for businesses. And as a result, for the CFO and the finance office, that we've realized through some prior lessons that we first need to stake out those parameters, the frameworks within which we want them to operate. But nonetheless, we do want them to run out, serve as a sponge to figure out, take HR. What in HR is regenerative AI doing today? And then we've provided basically a framework for those teams to fill out. And then each function has to circle back to our task force and present in a series of phases how they're going to make use of AI. And what we've said is the baseline is every function has to present a use case, an application of AI. Nobody can say it doesn't apply to us because we really want to test ourselves on that internally facing side of the house, in addition to the external. On the external, it couldn't come at a better time for us as a product, as a service provider, whether it's tools that help customers adopt and just utilize the basics of our applications better. Oh, you're using it, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, in this case. Well, have you thought about using it in these 5 other instances? So unlocking the power through self-guided, assisting and adopting tools for customers. We have certain applications like our contracts management that are benefiting from AI and allowing what used to be an incredibly manual process that paralegals, to review a contracts database for renewal dates for all of your upcoming vendors over the next 5 years might take them months and months of manual reviews, can now be done in hours and days through using some of our tooling, all the way to managing some of those sourcing events that I was talking about earlier and helping prompt those automatically when a SKU is running low. Why wait for someone to have to go check if that SKU is running low, have it be auto-populated and then auto-generate a sourcing event. So a lot of ways we're applying it and additional ways that we're planning on expanding.
Great overview for us. Thank you for that. We are now up to our finance strategic moment question, where we ask you just to supply one moment of strategic insight that you've had along the way. Again, we're looking for an illustration of how finance plays a strategic role in business. I know you've had so many of these, but we're looking for just one that you can illustrate for us. Anything come to mind?
There was one time when I had wrapped up my first CFO role. It was about 2015, and we had successfully exited and sold this one business, SumTotal, which was backed by Vista, to a strategic buyer. And I decided to use that as an opportunity to find a new role. And I stepped into a bigger company as CFO. That this was one of those times I was recruited by actually a placement firm that was a total shot in the dark, and the connection seemed very good on paper. So I was excited to jump in. What I learned very quickly was that even within private equity and within software, that there were so many different definitions of the CFO and what the CFO is expected to do, what might be incremental, where people are excited for you doing more than what might be within that traditional definition. But I had been taught in my first CFO role by both my CEO and my board that between the CFO and the CEO, they want to be able to understand pretty much at any given point in time what is going on in the business. And that was enabled a bit by that role because it was structured for me. I wasn't just in charge of FP&A, accounting, and tax, but I also had HR, legal, sales operations and renewals, IT, and hosting, as well as facilities. So it was arguably a little more of a COO/CFO role. But fast forward to this second role where it was actually a traditionally defined CFO role. And I started showing up at a couple of meetings that I think it was the second or third one where one of the other executives kind of stopped the meeting and said, and this was before remote days where you actually walked into a meeting, opened up the door, sat down, where the person stopped the meeting and said, Jeff, what are you doing here? Why are you in my meeting? And I have to admit, I was caught a bit without the ability to articulate in words why I was following my instinct. I was new to the business, and I wanted to understand what was going on in that particular area of it. I think it was a sales meeting actually, and they were laying out some of their go-to-market plans for the upcoming budget cycle. But it was a shock to me. And I realized that at almost every other step within that role that they had been around for a long time. They were a pretty big company and finance was very well established. And their swim lanes weren't expected to be swapped around or crossed. And I'll tell you, I didn't like it because back to that earlier comment about looking in the back versus and seeing the numbers as they occur, or do you want to be a part of helping drive the numbers so that when they do occur, they're better and the business is growing and we're creating shareholder value. And it really dawned on me, not just within that company, but across companies and across, frankly, private equity firms, across CEOs, that it does, you shouldn't assume, while I think that for me as a CFO is an incredibly attractive and valuable characteristic of wanting to be involved and understand as many areas of the business as possible. There are some teams, CEOs, ownership structures that don't expect that and are caught by surprise. And it can result in a pretty difficult breaking in, burning in time. So both a combination of making sure I do the due diligence, I understand the definition and descriptions of the role before taking it, but also understanding where you really fit as a person. I don't think I would be happy in just the strict silo of finance without the ability to understand what's coming down the road, what's around the corner, how are we doing in the business, competitively or otherwise. I'd say that one jumps out at me as a real important lesson that I've gone back to multiple times.
From episode 811, this is Jason Kane, CFO of Mills and Nebraska.
They should. But what I learned when I stepped into my first CFO role is if you're going to scale a business, putting system, process, dashboarding, and technology in place in a repeatable way. One of my favorite phrases is it scalable, is it portable? If you can't scale it with the business and you can't port it to a business you acquire, it's not a good system or technology. And so that is definitely something we're focusing on right now. That's something over the next year that we will really work on, is getting a couple seats filled in the team that is needed for growth, and then getting good baseline systems in place, getting good reporting, because it was and still is in some ways very Excel driven, but we're very rapidly moving toward a much more automated set. So yeah, big focus there.
We're going to jump to our mentoring round where I'll ask you several quick questions intended to inform and inspire finance leaders. We want you to think back to that first CFO tour of duty, that first 60 days of it, actually. And what is the piece of advice you wish you had as you stepped into that operations role and for the very first time and thought you knew so well? What would you tell yourself that first 60 days if you could go back in time?
Oh, it's a long list. I could come up with about 50 things. But the main one I'd say really goes back to that temperament that you need to take of being a sponge in the early days and soaking things in, the good and the bad, and understanding that if you're placed right in the business and you're perceived as approachable and interested and open to just non-core finance areas, other operational areas of the business, you're going to have a lot of things put in front of you that are going to my point earlier, be oh crap moments, and sometimes they can be quite unsettling. But take a deep breath, put them on a list, bring in other relevant functional experts, whether they're internal, other team members like your GC, definitely get to know your GC well, or external. And before anybody panics, get the facts and understand how it could play forward, and use that as a really critical tool in terms of relative prioritization. I'd say that's really one of the main lessons learned. Stay calm, get your facts, don't overreact, and those are just going to come day after day. And you usually don't know where the next one's going to come.
Nice, thanks for that. We also like to ask our guests to reflect a little on the personal side for us. We're wondering if you have a personal habit or some part of a daily routine that you're known for. Anything come to mind?
Oh yeah. I would say staying dissatisfied. I think it's dangerous. Push the boundaries, push your comfort to discomfort. If things are going well, understand why. If things aren't going well, definitely get to the bottom of it, but never be content. Sometimes that bleeds over into my personal life, which drives my family crazy, but professionally, it can be a real asset. But I would also say, make sure your team, particularly your ELT, knows that about you. Because if you're always using that in front of them, they may feel like you're questioning them or showing a lack of confidence in them. But if they understand where you're coming from, why you're asking those questions, I think it can create actually have the direct impact over time of creating kind of an important sense of accountability, actually, in terms of knowing and understanding what's driving results, good and bad. Stay dissatisfied. Always turn over the next stone.
Would you have a book selection for us?
Yes. I'd say the very first one that moved me into finance, period, was Liar's Poker by Michael Lewis, which I loved. Gave me even relevant to this day. I've had all my children read it as they head into college and beyond, just to understand really some really interesting aspects of investment banking. And then on a more practical level, Atomic Habits is a relatively newer one that my son actually referred me to. And it talks about things, we don't get lucky, things don't just happen. It's not like you can just work really hard for one weekend, catch up, and everything's going to be good. It's this long-term marathon. How do you sustain performance by putting together small steps, small habits over time, which in turn generate great results? Very little is truly due to luck. Most of it is really putting in the
Excellent.
time.
Great. We didn't have that one before, so thank you for that. We're up to our final question. Forgive me, we're right up on the hour. So we ask you to look forward finally and share your priorities as CFO of JAGGAER for the next 12 months. What would your priorities be?
Yes, I think it's a culmination of a few of the key things we've spoken about today. One of which is to sit side by side with our product management and development team to make sure that our investment dollars, and we continue to put a lot of money and our excess profits into ensuring that our product is state of the art, but that our investment dollars are really targeted to the many pain points, both new post-COVID, as well as those that are standing to continue to be relevant and emerge to solve the problems for our customers. So I think that marrying of that investment, not on a 3-year horizon, as we oftentimes do, which still, there are elements of that roadmap that of course require longer term planning, but more on that agile 3, 6, 9 month horizon to really pay attention to problems that are emerging and how we can ensure our tools and our analytics are enabling them. The other one is, frankly, me as a CFO. It's one of the things I enjoy the most about my role at JAGGAER and in this industry. I'm a target customer. I'm a target audience for our sales team, our products. And as we continue to see our tools become more strategic, they're moving from the decision maker or the buyer being more of the accounting team or the procurement department to be more of the CFO, CTO, FP&A team members who want to have a say in how do we get more analytics, how do we get more valuable insights and information out of our procurement, our supply chain areas of the business. And as a CFO, trying to elevate our sales proposition and our connectivity to that area, that target buyer. I'm having a lot of fun working very, very closely with our sales team and our marketing team as we continue to refine our go-to-market messaging heading into the second half of this year.
Jeff Laborde, thank you for joining us on CFO Thought Leader.
Thanks very much, Chad. My pleasure.
Hello, Thought Leader listeners. As you have perhaps already heard or even seen, we're now featuring the career lessons and moments of strategic insight shared by our CFO guests as Thought Leader videos. You can now find these videos on our blog at cfothoughtleader.com and, of course, our newsletters, but also on LinkedIn. If you haven't already, please go ahead and follow our CFO Thought Leader LinkedIn company page, and you'll be certain not to miss a single Thought Leader video debut. CFO Thought Leader, the #1 thought leadership platform exclusively for and by CFOs. As always, thank you for listening.